The purpose of this series of 4 videos is to walk you through the Bible text for each of the studies in Storming the City, Matthias Media's interactive Bible study on the Old Testament book of Nahum. The primary intention is to help Bible study group leaders in their preparation. But if the members of your group decide to do the walkthrough, that's all good too. So over the next little while, we'll be taking a look at the text of the Bible readings for Study 1, and I'll be pointing out a few things that hopefully will be of help as you get your head around what you're reading. You might still feel the need to look at a commentary, since I'm not attempting to do all that a good commentary would do. But my hope is that, in combination with some of the notes in the study, you won't necessarily feel like consulting a separate commentary is all that needed. I'll also refer to some of the study questions as we go along. By the way, if you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube and please pass on any feedback in the comments section. But that's enough preliminaries. Let's dive in. Study 1 is a little unusual because we barely look at the book of Nahum, which I admit seems a bit odd for a set of studies on Nahum. But in this study, we're trying to learn the historical context so that we understand Nahum's message better when we do actually start reading it in Study 2. The opening words of the book of Nahum tell us that it's an oracle concerning Nineveh. So it's pretty important that we understand who or what Nineveh is and what their relationship is with God and with God's people, the nation of Judah. As it says in the sidebar on page 10, the city of Nineveh was the centre of power of the nation of Assyria. Or perhaps it's better to refer to it as the centre of power of the empire of Assyria, because the Assyrian Empire was absolutely dominant at this time. So referring to the city of Nineveh is just another way of referring to Assyria. Now, hopefully some of your group will remember that Nineveh was the place that God wanted his prophet Jonah to go and preach. See Jonah 1 verse 2. And although Jonah was extremely reluctant, he did end up there and he did warn the Ninevites about God's looming judgment on them. And the Assyrians repented, as we're told in Jonah 3 verse 10. And as the table on page 11 shows, that took place sometime around 782 to 753 BC. But it seems like that Assyrian repentance didn't last all that long, because just a few decades later in 722 BC, Assyria did its whole conquest thing to Israel, the northern tribe of God's people, and completely wiped them off the map as a nation. And by 701 BC, Assyria had also conquered Judah, the southern tribe. So Nahum is delivering God's message in that period of the conquest and oppression of God's people by Assyria. And to get an idea of how Assyria dealt with Israel and Judah, we turn in the study to some of the history recorded for us in 2 Kings and Isaiah. So let's firstly open up 2 Kings 17 and take a look. And there's a couple of things particularly worth noting here. Firstly, in a matter-of-fact way, we're told that the king of Assyria was in total control over Israel. And when the Israelite king Hoshea shows a bit of resistance, the might and power of Assyria responds by besieging Israel for 3 years. But, secondly, we learn something about Israel and its king. Note the comment that the Israelite king did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, albeit perhaps not as badly as his predecessors. And I'm sure Hoshea's rebellious heart is reflected in his actions here, because rather than turning to God for help, he turns instead to the Egyptians. And, frankly, that wasn't a good choice. It doesn't end well. See verse 18? The Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. It's interesting to observe there that it's described as God's act to remove Israel, not just the act of Assyria. So that's Israel removed from the picture. What about Judah, the southern tribe? Let's turn to Isaiah 36. We're told in verse 1 that Assyria has conquered Judah, But the thing we're particularly interested to observe in this passage is the attitude of the Assyrians towards God's people and towards God. And so we get the fascinating story of the Rabshakeh, a high-ranking Assyrian military officer and representative of the Assyrian king, who brings a message to Judah's king, Hezekiah. And that message is scornful. He asks them about who they trust in to help them escape the control of Assyria. If it's Egypt, he says, they're wasting their time. Assyria is not in the least bit worried about Egypt. But then he says something interesting. The Rabshakeh is also scornful of Judah turning to the Lord for help. And he points out what we just read in 2 Kings, that God is actually using Assyria. Indeed, he says that God told him to go up against Judah. And the Rabshakeh wants all the soldiers of Judah to know that they are doomed. And he expresses it in the sort of way that reveals the level of cruelty Assyria was notorious for. But then the Rabshakeh says what he really thinks of Judah's God. He arrogantly points out in verse 20 that none of the nations Assyria has conquered were helped by their gods, and he expects Judah's God will be just as weak and useless as all the other gods when they face Assyria's might and power. So the Rabshakeh claims that God told the Assyrians to attack Judah, yet at the same time he expresses his total disdain for this God. And that's what question 3 in the study is highlighting. So what are we to make of this? What's going on? God gives us an insight into his view of it all in Isaiah 10 verses 5 to 12. So let's turn there. In this passage we see 2 truths, both of which will emerge as themes in the book of Nahum. The first truth is that God uses Assyria to punish his own nation. He calls Assyria the rod of my anger in verse 5. They are what God uses to punish the godless nation that Judah has become. But it's not like Assyria is being obedient to God. Not at all. God is using their wickedness, not their obedience. He knows, in verse 7, that Assyria isn't motivated by the idea of doing God's work. The thing that's in their hearts is the insatiable desire to plunder and destroy. And so the second truth is that the instrument of God's punishment of Judah is itself going to be punished by God. In other words, while God uses Assyria's evil for his purposes, it is still evil, and they are still accountable to him for it. And the message of Nahum is largely about that. And it's why question 4 in this study is actually pretty key. As we get into the text of Nahum, it's good to have a clear idea of God's attitude to all that is happening, and what God's role in it all is. But before we get into Nahum, it's worth just quickly looking at what it was about Judah that God might have been unhappy with. Why was he angry with Judah? Why did he call them a godless nation? And to get a feel for that, we'll turn to some of the history recorded for us in 2 Chronicles 33 and 34. Now it's quite a lot to read, so a really good option would be to ask people to read this passage in advance of your group meeting, and to do so with questions 5 and 6 in mind. Or you could just read the verses listed instead of all 2 chapters. Or you could also break into subgroups and each read a section of the 2 chapters and report back to the whole group. Basically, we hear in these chapters about the kings who came after Hezekiah and the way that Judah's relationship with God fluctuated with the nature of each successive king and to what extent he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Verses 5 and 6 give us a pretty good sense of the sort of evil that was going on in Judah. It was pretty terrible, including the horror of child sacrifice. Indeed, Judah is at times worse than the pagan nations around her, with some occasional and brief periods of national repentance mixed in. In fact, a more sustained and sincere period of national repentance begins with King Josiah, and a significant response of repentance is particularly prompted when they find the book of the law of the Lord. But that tells you something about where they'd got to, doesn't it? And that's what question 6 is getting at. Here is God's chosen nation, the nation which he has revealed himself to, given them his law so that they would know how to relate to him, and they disregarded that law so much that they actually lost the book. They forgot that it even existed, and they're shocked when they eventually find it and realise how shabbily they've treated their God. No wonder they were due for a sharp rebuke by the rod of God's anger. But note that as part of that national repentance, they make a covenant to be obedient to God from now on. And it's probably worth making a mental note of that covenant as you answer question 7, because I think it's referred to in the message of Nahum. Of course, even our brief look at their history in this passage ought to make us a little sceptical about how sustained Judah's national repentance under Josiah is going to be. So as we turn to the book of Nahum, we can be sure that any relief for Judah, by removing Assyria, is going to be very much an act of God's grace towards them, as well as an act of justice against Assyria's evil ways. As with a lot of the Old Testament, the picture we get in this study is of the mighty God of the nations, the God who is in control even of the most powerful empire that arrogantly defies him. And so the second implication question on page 14 is therefore worth spending some time reflecting on. You see, it's one thing to read that God was in total charge of the world back then, but are we confident that he's still sovereign over our current world? A world that often seems chaotic, with human evil frequently seeming to prevail, both at a global and a personal level. The sovereignty of God is a pastorally rich and reassuring idea, so I encourage you to take the time to drive that home to your group and to talk honestly about when it's a struggle and challenge to keep trusting that truth. Next up, we finally get to Nahum.